Productivity. It's a term plastered across many of your favorite YouTube channels. It's in your mind when you're at work. It's probably the word you think about most when you're trying to plan out how your day will go. But there's a big problem with productivity culture when taken to the extreme. Call it the productivity paradox if you'd like, because when we place too much emphasis on productivity, it fundamentally changes how we assess what actions and ways of living are most valuable to us. When we define valuable action as anything that seems to produce something for ourselves, anything that advances us in some way, we can easily get caught in the cycle of productivity for its own sake. Many of us get caught in this trend of pushing ourselves to the utmost limits in pursuit of goals because we consider them through the frame of making us more productive individuals, rather than because we see these goals as aligning with our innermost values. Don't get me wrong here, there's nothing wrong with being the sort of person who strives to better themselves. And there's also nothing wrong with being a diligent worker. But what exactly is it that drives this trend of enhancing one's personal productivity at all costs? Why, in the last 10 years, has a whole separate market emerged around the subject of how to be more productive? And does this point to broader, more worrying societal processes at work? As the writer Oliver Burkeman has stated, often personal productivity presents itself as an antidote to busyness, when it might better be understood as yet another form of busyness, to keep us sufficiently distracted, so that we don't have to ask ourselves potentially terrifying questions about how we're spending our day. Have you ever found yourself experiencing an unusual sense of guilt when you feel that you're in some way failing to attain expectations about how productive you should be? You might feel that guilt regardless of whether you tried your best in that situation or whether there were factors outside of your control that influence the outcome. To some extent, that's because we live in a climate that increasingly tells us our very self-worth is seemingly defined by how productive we can be, by how many goals we can surpass in a year, or how many books we can read in a month. It's pretty common to hear people confess that they've struggled with an imposter syndrome, that they have this nagging sense of self-doubt and a constant fear of being exposed as a fake person. To a degree, I think this newfound proliferation of this phrase partially stems from hustle culture and the processes of social comparison that it engenders, leading people to believe at an unconscious level that despite the amount of progress they make or amazing things they achieve, they're at some level still just acting. Another commonly experienced problem associated with this is the sensation that when we attain short or long-term goals, our satisfaction can feel surprisingly brief because we never quite take stock of the value of that achievement on its own terms. Sometimes the fetishization of productivity leads us to forget how important non-productive hobbies and activities are to our personal growth and learning. It can even radically transform the way that we approach our leisure time and our relationships with others. What I'm saying here is that we often feel this inner compulsion to use our leisure time productively, even if we're not fully conscious of it. Think about the process of traveling, wherein many people feel they need to capture and post as many images as possible to demonstrate what they got out of a trip. People travel with a mentality that, on some level, they must get something out of it, rather than embrace the experience on its own terms. And this often leads them to some sense of disappointment if they feel they didn't gain something from their journey. This process can even be seen in the way that platforms like YouTube approach books and reading, where the most popular book reviews are not just interesting pieces of fiction, but usually self-help books that are judged purely in terms of their utility to the productive individual. Again, the idea is that something has to be obviously useful in order for it to hold merit and for us to engage with it, but this simply isn't true because some of the most rewarding experiences or moments of insight in our lives are usually brought about when we aren't necessarily looking to gain anything. In fact, often those drawn out spaces of free time or boredom are what we need to gain a new perspective on life. Moreover, in the 1962 book The Decline of Pleasure, the writer Walter Kerr observed that we are all of us compelled to read for profit, party for contracts, and lunch for contacts. His point here is that even without realizing it, we can sometimes view our relationships with others as a means to an end, particularly ends which are based in work and profit. In understanding where this all comes from, we can turn to the works of French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault and his writings on neoliberalism, which for him is all about the infiltration of market-driven norms into everyday life. especially through creating forms of self-management and broader social relations that are based on, in his terms, discipline, efficiency, and competitiveness. Foucault's work is particularly interesting in approaching something like this, because he suggests that we should always take a historical approach in explaining societal behavior. He is deeply suspicious of the notion of human nature, because this is a concept that can be weaponized by those in power to normalize the way we approach things now, rather than see them as a product of particular historical and social processes. What are the main impacts of neoliberalism on how we view productivity in modern culture? Firstly, Foucault describes the institution of technologies of subjectivity, which is just a way of saying that neoliberalism strategically changes people's behavior and choices in a way that optimizes their actions towards capital accumulation and maximizing productivity. A major way this happens is that the individual becomes conceptualized as an enterprise. They view themselves almost as if they were a commodity defined by their utility to the broader social market and their ability to sell themselves on this market. For Foucault, competition plays a key role in all of this, and the role of the neoliberal state is to basically intervene on society so that competitive mechanisms can play a regulatory role at every moment and every point in society. This is reflective of Foucault's broader insight to how power operates in the modern world, which is to say power doesn't just condition us by means of repression and placing limitations on what we can say or do. Rather, it actively produces us as subjects by shaping our relationships with ourselves and with others. This competition drives us to a way of living where we feel we need to constantly break our own barriers and limitations to surpass and transcend whatever we've done before in order to be happy. We often read this as a way of achieving a liberating freedom for ourselves despite society's constraints. But Foucault allows us to think about this in a different way, namely that our subjective sense of individual freedom is actually what is being subtly manipulated under neoliberalism. In the terms of the academic Daniele Lorenzini, this is also what is so inherently powerful about neoliberal government, the possibility of transforming the governed into a receptive and malleable subject without directly constraining her will. Now, some thinkers still think that this is a fairly positive process in the long term. The American neoliberal Gary Becker has remarked on the way that neoliberal subjects are increasingly subject entrepreneurs who must maximize their own capital in order to compete in the global market, usually by exploiting a combination of the advantages of one's background as well as one's personal areas of competence. He argues that in extending the principles of economic rationality beyond the field of just the market, the newfound perception of individuals as entrepreneurs allows them to attain a sense of rationality, freedom, and intelligibility to their actions that they simply didn't have before. But again, Lorenzini remarks that when we view ourselves as if we are defined by the stock of competencies that we possess now, rather than taking a more holistic approach to who we are, this means we're always evaluating our self-worth in relation to the distant future. At its worst, this can lead to a very precarious, uncertain mode of living, always reliant on constant and tiring self-evaluation and self-improvement metrics. The final thing that's of note in the way we approach productivity is the fact that our current approach can exacerbate the trend towards individualism and rejection of the socially oriented nature of our identity as human beings. It can lead us to treat collective problems as if they were individual ones, thus stifling our ability to rethink and change the norms by which we live. This isn't something that is directly advised by productivity gurus, but it is a byproduct of a culture that sees self-improvement as a project that is purely personal, thereby placing our relationships with others as something of secondary importance. Ultimately, Foucault points out that the ancient Greek conception of how we become a better version of ourselves was rooted in our ability to relate with others, and was thus very different. The care of the self, the process of working on yourself and attaining knowledge about who you are, was always framed as a deeply ethical process that also prepared an individual better for the social world and their relationships with people around them. So, it's also worth questioning how productivity culture changes the extent to which we see ourselves as contributing towards a wider community. At the end of the day, remember that you are not a machine. You're a human being with complex tastes and needs and desires that will never be fulfilled through the lens of productivity alone, and your worth is certainly not tied to your productivity either. So maybe you should rethink whether productivity should be the central lens with which you approach life, or whether your desire to be productive masks your avoidance of the deeper questions you know you've been putting off. For, as Nietzsche memorably remarked, haste is universal because everyone is in flight from himself.